Alrighty, let's start out with a welcome for segment number 2 of Hyper-V virtual networking. All of that from Yates Computers Tips and Reviews. So I wanted to break these up because understanding how to run Hyper-V, knowing how to set up Hyper-V, knowing how to set up this next part was really one of the problems that took me a long time and a lot of research and a lot of trial and error to figure out how to get this to work. And knowing what you have and what you don't have is really the interesting part of it. So basically, once you get the Hyper-V open, let me close that out because that does not need to run. You can shut it off. Here I want to remove this. I don't need that virtual machine. And again, this is part of something you'll see later too when you get into the OS. It confirms, do you want to delete this? Yeah, I want to delete that. Boom, it's gone. So after you install Hyper-V, you will end up with virtual NICs and primary NICs basically. And this Windows 11 is pending the current update, so it's giving me some kind of weird settings that I'm not used to. I think once I get the newest patches in here, it will clear this up. Need to go to networking. Wanted to show one of the really major things that I saw that changed once you load in Hyper-V. I don't know why that bridge is on. This one's interesting. Usually on the other computer that I set this up on, it turns all of this off. And it would set up a virtual NIC. That virtual NIC would then carry all those settings. Command prompt. IP config will show you all your network cards that you have connected, what they are, your default switch, all the different IP ranges. So from that point, you know what you kind of have. From then, you go into these settings here. By default, it loads this default switch. What I ended up using was external. You can click on them. They'll give you a basic breakdown of what the terms are. If you watch the other video that I have with the NIC card and the router, this is where the concept got really strange to me, because you go from physical NIC to virtual NIC to a virtual switch to a NIC instead of staying all within the NICs. The virtual switch is what really threw me off. Once you figure this out, it's pretty much a breeze, I think, from that point. The one thing I figured out, if you want the fixed IP on your devices, that is all done in the OS. not in the NIC, virtual NIC, or the switch. The only place in the virtual NIC for the fixed IP, if you're on external, is for the host computer will get that fixed IP. Because then all your virtuals go through the virtual switch, and then you put in the manual IP in the virtual OS. So that's why I have the video on the virtual OS, because these are all really tied together. All three of these things. It's not you just go in and put this in and then boom, everything's done. So it took a little bit of research myself to figure that out. So wanted to express that point. So basically you can set up an external, hit create. You have to know what NIC is what. So if you're in a business environment and you have 4 NICs, you might have an Intel NIC with 4 ports, like that video, like the NIC card I've showed in the video. That's why I showed that, because it's a single NIC. It's an Intel, it's an IBM, it's a ASUS, it's a whatever brand of NIC card, and it's going to give you port 1, port 2, port 3, and you're going to have to figure that out. You're going to have to know what is number 1. What's it connected to? Is that my internet? Is that my internal? Is that, accounting network? Is that a research network? Is that, you're going to need to know that. So it's best to go in and label those NICs. Okay, number 2, look at the MAC address. Look at, the IP, whatever you got to do. Figure out where that is attached to, and to know where that's attached to, and name that that video card number 2 is to research department. So that way when you go into these and you see, oh, it's Intel blah 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 blah, or it's Realtek, number 2, well, it would say Realtek, accounting, Realtek finance, Realtek research, and you would know, instead of trying to remember, okay, where's 1, where's 2, because what happens if you have multiple cards in there, like 2 Intel card, 4 ports that are listing 1, 2, 3, 4. You have 2 number 1s, you have 2 number 2s, because it's the same kind of card, but they're different cards, they're going to list pretty much the same. You're not going to know what's what. So to label that. One of the other things that I thought was very interesting was this: the MAC addresses. You might end up with a conflict in the MAC addresses. If by some reason you have a MAC address that's already being used, you might need to edit this. So that's one issue I know a lot of people don't look at and don't really realize, because they don't look at the MAC addresses, because they're not really supposed to duplicate, but you're manually entering MAC addresses. So you can duplicate, you can walk over one, because you're manually inputting it there. So that's one of the little areas I wanted to cover and point that I saw. But you set these up. You can set up as many of these you want. I showed you earlier where it said the default. So let me just start applying a bunch of these, because oh no, I don't want to do that. Crash my download. I want it on here because I'm using the wireless. Go here. Let's go internal. Naming these also is a very good idea for you to know what is what. if it's an external, it's recommended you label it external, whatever port, whatever you want. I'm just going to do it the short way to start with. And I'll show you where this issue or where this really applies. See, now this one, you can apply it private. It doesn't ask you a NIC card. Why is that not set up? Oh, create virtual. Fairly easy. You pretty much click what you need to know, click it, and you're done. And, that's fine. Now, if you go into these settings, as you see, you can connect to it. Go into the settings of your virtual OS. Wanted to make sure that I express the differences about what these things are, because I had a hard time with people really explaining it and it written down. But if you go into add new hardware, it asks you right here, add new NIC adapter. When you hit new NIC adapter, watch this. This is the list of things you just put in. So this is where you give that virtual machine multiple connections, multiple virtual NICs or NICs on that virtual machine, so that way it can connect out to 4 networks, 5 networks, wherever it needs to talk to, accounting, research, internet, all those different networks, all the different subnets, all the different things that you run into that system. And if you have 6 or 7 of those set up, because you might be running 5 different servers on there, 5 different virtual servers. And when you run those 5 different virtual servers, you might need different NIC configurations for those different servers. You might end up putting security software on there, putting a DC on there, and when you load that security software on there, you might need a virtual server or 2 with that security server. So with that security server, you might need to have internet that might be coming from another place. You might need to be attached to a marketing department or some other department, and you might actually want a virtual connection so that those security servers and those things can actually communicate between each other without going through your other NIC, without going through the accounting department or research department and back through to the other ones. You have a virtual private network between those VMs. This is where it's all set up right here. So I wanted to go through and show that, because that was the interesting part. That's where it got interesting, because this is just a virtual OS. This turns on and runs. This is actually where you actually physically install the hardware, so that that virtual machine will actually be able to see that and know it's there and be able to use that. So that was one that took me a little while to figure out, okay, how does this work? How does that work? How do you what configurations do I want? So this is that virtual NIC environment, knowing that once I got from, and that was a Windows 10 computer that I put it on, so that might be the difference between the Windows 11 and 10, that it gave me your NIC, and then a virtual NIC. The virtual NIC was the extension of that NIC. That virtual NIC is where you put all your settings at that point of what you want it, how you want it, the same as you would if you're a standalone server. So that was kind of the interesting part, to realize that a standalone system and a virtual system, those settings changed completely. Then you got into this aspect of a virtual switch. So that was kind of weird to me that you went from networks, cards, to NICs to a switch. And that switch is basically to handle multiple virtual machines. It's switching between the 2 or 3 or 5. So that was kind of the interesting point that I found. So I wanted to cover that in enough detail and show how that is actually set up. It's really not that difficult. Once you do it the once for the Hyper-V on that computer, you're pretty much going to be done. You might need to add 1 or 2 if you add more networks, if you add more ports, NICs, if you add, more VMs that you need a special configuration. You can do all that right through here. So the basic differences is when you go in here, private network and extended, or external, sorry. External is the one I used. External actually gave me it as in, these are 3 separate systems where I can actually set the IP for the host. Default was more or less where it used network translation, where those 2 systems talked to the host and then the host talked out onto the network. So it did routing. It gave it a different IP address. External made it so that I can give it a fixed IP, that anything on that network, if I put in, okay, I need to go to 10.100.80, it would take me there. If I need to go to 192.168.1.10, it would take me to that server. Where the other one would let it communicate, but you couldn't really talk, you couldn't pull it up directly. And that's what I wanted. I wanted it to look like just another standard system on the network, that when you typed in that IP address, that you didn't realize, oh, it's a virtual machine, it's this, it's that. It was prompting you for the username, password. You can do network discovery, and you can do all of those things, and you can see that IP address there. So that's what I was looking for. So you have some differences there. Internal, and again, private does not talk to that NIC at all. It talks to the virtual machines only. So you can actually read that. So that's basically the networking part of it. It wasn't that complicated, but I wanted to go through and actually show that, because I did have to go and do some research and figure that out. And then how do you add it? How do you get that OS to use multiple NICs and all of that? Well, that's up next. But that's fairly simple. Let me go ahead and stop this part of the video and move on to the